Eric Eggers, thanks for joining me here on the Pod's Honest Truth. Really appreciate it.
Hey, great to be here.
Well, look, your book, and I've got it here, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. It's a fascinating read, and it's, boy, is it a timely read, especially now with all the talk about Democrats wanting funding for mail-in balloting, and you devote a whole chapter to absentee balloting, and really more than just absentee balloting, this whole idea of fraud when it comes to mail-in balloting. Can you kind of take me through some of the concerns that people have about the mail-in balloting process?
Yeah, absolutely, David. I mean, the reality is that even if you're inclined to not think that voter fraud is a serious concern to American democracy, even those people would acknowledge that absentee balloting is by far the most vulnerable and susceptible form of voting to fraudulent and bad actors. So, I mean, if you go into a polling place and cast a traditional ballot, there's no kind of gap in the delivery mechanism. You have your ballot there, then it goes in the box and it's done, assuming that the person that's counting the ballots is an honest broker. But when it comes to absentee ballots, you introduce so much more uncertainty into the process. And so one of the things I talk about in the book are a litany of examples of these paid political operatives. In Texas, they're known as politiqueros. In South Florida, they're known as balloteros. I mean, these are people whose job it is essentially to go out, track down people, help them request ballots, and then know when the ballots will be there. And then oftentimes they just cut the actual voter out of the process altogether. So by introducing voting that's not taking place in the polling place, you've removed several layers of security in a process in terms of voting that it isn't all that secure to begin with.
So let's take this through here a little bit in terms of layers. So there's obviously an ethical layer here, and there's a potential legal layer as well, because you can basically, some of this, at least through certain state laws, isn't necessarily illegal. Obviously, for forging signatures, that's illegal. But I'm talking about helping someone and suggesting how they vote. There's a lot of murky areas here. Can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually one of the things that I think was most troubling to me in terms of the language the Democrats are trying to insert in one of the coronavirus stimulus packages, because not only were they trying to nationalize mail-in balloting, but they're also trying to legalize the national practice of what's called ballot harvesting, or the third-party assistance of solicitation and collection of ballots. And so the reason why that's so concerning is in states that do all their voting online, states like Oregon, for example, recent data suggests that 5% of voters in Oregon admit someone else has marked their ballot. So I think that obviously raises some concern. But you're right that there are several different kind of nuances in terms of what's legal where. So California, ahead of the 2018 elections, became the first state to legalize ballot harvesting, or the third-party collection of ballots. And so what became very confusing is that California saw massive gains for Democrats in House seats across the state, including in Orange County, which up to that point had been a conservative stronghold. While at the same time in North Carolina, you actually saw a congressional seat being challenged and actually taken to court because of the same practice. The difference is in North Carolina, that practice is actually illegal. So North Carolina is one of the few states that explicitly prohibits that practice. And so, but many states kind of don't have laws governing it one way or another. In Florida, it's quite common. The practice is actually called, senior citizens tend to be targeted by these third-party operatives in a practice known as granny farming. In the book, I talk about this lady who had a notebook detailing thousands of transactions where she would go and collect ballots and deliver the vote essentially for these paid political campaigns. So, the third-party collection of the ballots in terms of ballot harvesting is by far, I think, the most concerning thing to come out of this, this coronavirus relief package, which is supposed to make the country healthier. And oh, by the way, here we are being told, I mean, you're doing, this from your home, right? We're all kind of shut down. The legalization of ballot harvesting, in reality, would have young, potentially asymptomatic carriers of the coronavirus going door to door and interacting with, these vulnerable populations, these senior citizens, potentially impairing their actual health, not to mention the health of America's democracy. So I think it's very concerning.
Well, that's a very interesting point. I didn't think about that. You did mention granny farming. It's something I do want to talk about. I found it interesting. I know you know all about it, but I got to tell you, I think you line 10 people up on the street, you'd say granny farming. I don't think they know what you're talking about. Can you explain exactly what this is all about as it relates to nursing homes and how vulnerable uh, senior citizens here are to that, and how widespread is this, and how does it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, because the bias in America's voting system is always towards the voter and counting the ballot, which of course makes sense. You don't want to disenfranchise anybody that's a legal voter, but we tend to not really look very hard to see and investigate, actual instances of fraud. So when the instances do get documented, I think it's important that we kind of learn from those. And so in the book, one of the things we talk about is there was in South Florida, there were these three political candidates all kind of using the same political machinery. And they're going around and soliciting the ballots on behalf of these elderly people and then helping them fill it out. One gentleman actually testified, and he's visually impaired. He's legitimately blind, and said, no, I didn't fill out this ballot. Somebody filled it out for me against my wishes. And, they took the newspaper that did the investigation, took evidence of that to the state attorney. Unfortunately, the state attorney is, he's got further political aspirations. He's a Democrat. The three political candidates were Democrats. And so, the reality is, the cold political calculus is, if you're a Democrat with statewide political ambitions, you're probably not furthering those ambitions by prosecuting voter fraud against, minority Democratic candidates. So, that's been a frustrating aspect in terms of looking for more in-depth investigations into the absentee ballot fraud. But granny farming, to the point, is essentially just the targeting of senior citizen populations by going to nursing homes, going to housing projects, going to places where these vulnerable populations live in large numbers. And then they go around and they just become, hey, can I help you request this ballot? And we have, testimony from people that would say, oh, we'd watch these operatives do it. They'd go around, they'd help these people fill out the ballot request forms, and they'd put those in the mail. And once you know that the ballot request forms are in the mail, then it's only a matter of days before the actual ballot shows up. So you just sit there and watch the mailbox. When the mailman comes, the ballots have arrived, and then those operatives go and they knock on the door, and then they continue to help the senior citizen fill out the ballot.
So, Eric, talk to me about minority communities, because I know this is obviously concern within minority communities as it relates to, I guess, ballot harvesting. I'm not sure exactly what you would call it, but minority communities, but also the elderly, because if you take a wide view of it here, there's been a lot of questions as to who this potentially a full mail-in balloting, who might actually benefit. Would that be Democrats? Would it be Republicans? I mean, most people think Democrats would benefit from it, but there's been talk, especially in the mainstream media, and I put that in quotes, but they're saying, well, wait a minute, Republicans aren't necessarily opposed to maybe more mail-in balloting. So what's the sense here? Because with mail-in balloting, I mean, if it's about senior citizens potentially, and there are a lot more seniors that vote Republican than Democrats. So how do you see this playing?
It's a great question. And so I think it's important that we distinguish between, the form of absentee balloting that occurs today, in which political, observers have correctly pointed out that Republicans tend to win the absentee ballot votes, specifically in Florida and other swing states. But there's a difference between that and allowing people to request absentee ballots. They feel like that's their preferred method of voting, and mailing a ballot to every registered voter in the country, which is the Democrats' proposal. And so the reason why I think people are saying that the latter would benefit Democrats is because we know that we have massively flawed voter registration databases in this country, right? The Supreme Court cited Pew Center statistics that said 24 million, and this is 8 years ago, 24 million voter registrations are significantly flawed or just completely wrong. So, and we have no reason to think the number's gone down since then. Part of that's because anytime states try to do an honest investigation and a thorough analysis of the accuracy of their voter rolls, they tend to be sued by Democratic operatives to prevent them from doing so. So, but if you imagine that we're now going to enter this Democrat fantasy land where we're mailing ballots to every registered voter, I think that starts to swing the other way, because now you've got tens of millions of ballots that are going to not actual voters, right? Which just create tens of millions of ballots that create opportunities for fraud. So I think that's where people draw the distinction. But it's a great question. It's a great point you make.
Well, so then is Donald Trump onto something when he says that, mail-in balloting and fraud, this is a real problem? Because some Republicans are, at least the way the media is terming it, some Republicans say it's not so bad, and Donald Trump's like, there's total fraud in this.
So I think what he's definitely not wrong about is the fact that it creates the potential for fraud at a scale I think unprecedented in this country's history if we mail ballots to every registered voter in the country. Because the reality is, I mean, California, and I think Donald Trump noted this during his press conference recently, California just settled the Judicial Watch about 1 million registered voters having to be removed from the voter rolls. And that's just one state. So I think there's been data that suggests that maybe something in the neighborhood of 280 counties have more registered voters than citizens of legal voting age. So, we've got massive problems with the voter rolls across the country. So if you decide as a matter of national policy, we're not just going to mail everybody that's registered a ballot. Oh, by the way, if we know that that's going to become policy, what do you think happens to the voter registration drives? It's a documented vulnerability that when you are registering new voters, the key is if you can just register people on the last day, then they don't have the time to go through the normal system of checks and balances. And again, the bias in favor of letting people get on the rolls. And once they're on the rolls, they're essentially a legal voter, and it's almost impossible to remove them. So, it takes matters of like extreme circumstances. I live here in Florida, and, actually in Tallahassee, Florida, the capital, and the Tallahassee mayor actually ran for governor, recently. And it was because of some investigations we had done. We actually discovered that the former mayor's brother, who we had an FBI affidavit saying he actually lived in Chicago, but we had evidence that he was still voting in Tallahassee, presumably voting for his brother in 2014. We were able to take that evidence to the supervisor of election, and he was removed. But that's what it takes. It takes having to go through. And so the point is, why are independent investigators doing that? Why are not the actual election supervisors taking that role on? It's just because they have so much else to do. They're not looking to get rid of the illegal voters. They're just trying to get as many legal voters on the rolls as possible.
Eric, in your book on a broader question, it says fraud, how the left plans to steal the next election. Why do you say the left rather than politicians or Republicans and Democrats? You focus on the left. There's got to be a reason for that, obviously, in the book. And I'm wondering if you can tell me why they would have more reason to want to steal the election than maybe the other side, if you will.
Yeah, I think it's because when we sort of did the systemic analysis of where the incentive structures are and what's stopping steps that would make, I think, American elections more secure, what we discovered is essentially two things. Is that number one, these massive vulnerabilities in the voter rolls are basically being protected by these left-wing groups that are financed by people like George Soros, Mark Elias, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign attorney in 2016. They're regularly suing states to prevent them from either implementing voter ID or doing checks on the veracity and accuracy of the voter rolls, while at the same time you've got other source-funded groups that fund like Acorn, or formerly known as Acorn, La Raza, these paid political operations, who then go out and I think try to collect as many and exploit those vulnerabilities that the legal operation kind of fight to make sure still exists. So that's why I would say the left, because it does appear to be an organized operation that's very tactical, very strategic, that on the one hand legally we're fighting to make sure the vulnerabilities exist, on the second hand we're paying groups to go out and round up as many people and kind of shoving them through those gaping holes to the detriment, I think, of American democracy.
Eric, let me ask you one last question. What about the disenfranchised argument? This idea that Democrats say, hey, we don't want to disenfranchise voters. In other words, we've got the coronavirus pandemic. We don't want to necessarily see them go to the polls in person. If they've got an uncomfortability with it, we want to give them a mail-in ballot. So why even try to fight against mail-in balloting? Because that would disenfranchise voters. What's kind of the response to that?
Well, I would say I have no problem with people using a mail-in ballot. I think you saw a bit of back and forth between President Trump and a reporter. She said, well, did you use an absentee ballot? And he said, absolutely. And then she says, well, why are you against it? I'm not against people using absentee ballots. I have parents and grandparents, and I want them to vote in whatever way they feel comfortable. But there's a difference between requesting and using an absentee ballot in the manner in which our current, democratic systems are set up to operate with and execute, and radically changing, without having ensured that our voter rolls are more secure, and without having increased the capacity at our supervisor of elections offices to be able to ensure that those ballots that come in, now we're talking about, tens of millions of signatures that we have to confirm to match. It creates a whole new burden. Plus, think about the idea of like where votes are cast now. It's by definition a decentralized process, right? Some people vote here, some people vote here, some people vote here. Now, if you start doing national absentee balloting, all the ballots are going to come into the one supervisor of elections office. It just seems like a totally unsustainable and unsecured scenario. So, yeah, don't have any problem with people requesting absentee ballots the way the system's currently set up. But I think that mailing everyone, whether they requested one or not, an absentee ballot is a very different scenario.
Eric Eggers, it's a great book, Fraud, How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election. Really an underreported topic in America, and the deep dive that you do, really important, especially in this day and age. Eric, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Stay safe.